believe we are all here and ready to go. We have some amazing R01 recipients, and some of you also have been reviewers. So feel free to bring that into the conversation as well. We have Dr. Linda Rinaman. Rinaman. Darn it, I was getting so
it's close. I think it should be Rinaman based on that's how most people pronounce it, but it's actually Rinaman.
Rinaman, great. Okay, so Dr. Linda Rinaman is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at FSU. Dr. Frankie Wong is a professor of nursing, and Dr. Aaron Wilbur is an assistant professor of neuroscience, all at FSU, and all recipients of R01s. Thank you all for being with us today and giving your time to share your experiences with us. I wanted to ask what your experience with R01s is. And Frankie, would you like to start? Oh, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, well, good. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me for this. And I really appreciate the conversation of the two previous panel that give me a sense of what I would like to say. Actually, I'm a psychologist. I'm the only non-nurse in the nursing department. So I'm a social psychologist by training. My first R01 was from NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, and I've been funded by NIDA. My current grant is from National Minority Health and Health Disparity. I have also funded by Child Health and Human Development and Allergy and Infectious Diseases. My work is mostly in HIV. Just for a piece of information, I believe that I'm one of the few people doing HIV work. So if you're doing HIV, the submission cycle is different. Submission cycle is always January 7, May 7, and September 7. Okay, so if you're submitting for January 7, you better not to think about having your Christmas because you're gonna work through the whole thing, all that thing. And I appreciate the conversations about how to write a competitive grant, but what I would like to share with you is about some of my own experience of having been funded for 2 decades by different NIH institutes about some of the scientific culture, not so much about what you know, but what is around you to make your work possible. To give you one example, in 2013, I was very lucky to get an R01 from NIH, Allergy and Infectious Disease, and to study HIV and HCV. So my longtime NIH colleagues and one of my favorite program officers who has since retired from NIH called me up saying that, Frankie, congratulations. I said, on what? She said, you got a grant from NIH. I said, yeah, but just like any other grant, I work very hard on it. So, and she said, now you finally be part of the big boy club now. I said, I don't quite understand what you're saying. But it turns out even within the NIH structure, what institute is considered the most prestigious? NIH, in this case, is considered one of the most prestigious institutes within the NIH structure. So I said, Susan, I don't think I'm any smarter when I was your grantee, all right? So that got back to a lot of the conversation in the past 2 panels. It is very important to cultivate that relationship. I just happened to fall into the NIH thing. Then there are political relationships, political factor that factor into this whole thing. I started working on a grant in 2015. It's an R21. As a matter of fact, I just sent in a just in time only an hour ago. That grant was to do work in Tajikistan. It took me till 2017 from NIMH saying that, oh, we love this grant, we want to fund it. Then we have a new president. All of a sudden, the grant got stopped because for all international grants, you need state clearance from the State Department. The State Department would not give me clearance. That was the first time in my entire career that I did not get any clearance from State Department because I have always done international work. And we appealed 3 levels, but they were just saying that the grant is too sensitive. We won't fund it. No other reason. So I didn't get funded. I retooled the grant not to do work in Tajikistan. On top of that, I was being blacklisted by Tajik government. I retooled the grant to study in Vietnam. And I went through the whole thing. An hour ago, council met last week. I was asked for just in time. So that means like there is great hope. This particular grant that I started in 2015 potentially would be funded. The concept would be funded in Vietnam. So this is what Alan talked about, being relentless. You need to be persistent to focus on your scientific career. So these are all the scientific culture that you have no control sometimes. My grant in Tajikistan and NIH said that this is the first study on mental health among sexual minority. We really want to fund this study, but all the political storm in 2016-17, when we have a new president with Tajik government. For those of you who do not know about Tajik former Soviet bloc, independent now, but majority of the population are Muslim, even though it's a secular country. So to get an NIH grant, whether it's an R01 and R21, I assume that you are scientifically competent. It's really the other pieces you need to learn how to manage your grant appropriately, making sure that like you're not misspending money, and then all the political force that you have control, you don't have control. In 2003, my former dean was looking all over for me because the Family Value Coalition picked up one of my grants. And I was one of the 200 people blacklisted by the Family Value Coalition about potentially using federal dollar to promote a certain lifestyle. So fortunately, nothing happened to me, but 5 of my colleagues was blacklisted. And one colleague ended up having to, his university didn't support him. So he quit. So my current grant right now, the COVID really make a big hit on me because I have to collect blood. I also have to collect like certain types of hypertension indicator using a cuff people have to wear 24 hours. That is a major specific aim because of the COVID. That entire aim is not there anymore. I only have 89 specimens. So fortunately, the agency, the institute was very accommodating. They allowed me to continue to do my study. I would not be fully address my original aim, which I rely on the blood to measure cytokine. But I was able to use at least whatever thing I have to address portion of the aim. So I can share a lot of these scientific cultural things that I think you should know your science is really knowing how the system works that make you a scientist, an ex-scientist. I'll just stop here.
Thank you so much. Linda, would you like to go next?
Sure. I don't have as interesting or compelling a story to tell, but just to answer the question about the institutes, I've been a co-PI or an investigator on grants from NIDCR and NICHD, but my own grants have been through NIMH and also NIDDK, and sort of sometimes both at the same time, sometimes one, sometimes the other, sort of going back and forth between institutes. I currently have a grant from both of them now. One is a R01 that I'm the only, I'm the PI, and the other is a multi-PI R01. And so I'm, they don't even call it co-PI, they say multi-PI, because it's almost like a program project grant. It's essentially separate projects being done in separate locations, but in a highly integrated way to pursue a common set of aims. And that it's my first time being on a multi-PI grant. And yeah, so that's all I'll say for now. I'll wait for questions.
All right, and Aaron?
Yeah, so I'm a little earlier in my career, so my story is even shorter as we move down the line here. So I'll just back up to the beginning since it's so short. So I had NIMH funding for the F31 and F32 level, and then I switched for K9 R00 and got NIA funding, aging. And then I also just got an R01 in aging, NIA again. I've been trying to get another line of research funded that hasn't hit yet, and there I've tried NIMDS and then also NIMH. I think I'm going to try and stick it out with NIMH on that line now and see if I can get it to hit there. But yeah, that's my short story on institutes.
That's awesome. All right, so I wanted to ask each of you, how did you know, and we will get into some of the details too about the specifics, but how did you know that the R01 was the right mechanism for you as opposed to R03 or something like that? And if you want to just go in any particular order, or we can set an order, whatever works best for you.
Well, for R01, you need preliminary data. So I would not recommend R01 if you don't really have really solid preliminary data. And personally, I don't particularly care for, it's not so much about the money, because working on an R03 or an R21 is just as much work as an R01. So you might as well think big, be aspirational instead of like just, unless like your study is just so preliminary, it is not possible for you to aim for an R01. So that's why my study in Vietnam is really at a very preliminary stage. So that's why I'm not aiming for an R01, I'm aiming for an R21.
Yeah, I would just say my R01 awards, have developed out of established research. So, I initially had, postdoctoral funding. They used to call it something different. It wasn't an F32, it was something else back in the old days. But that transitioned into like a scientist development award, which transitioned into an R01. So I always had a lot of published and preliminary data, and I built, one track going that way. Now, when I first applied for NIDDK funding, I did in fact first apply for an R21 because I had a little bit of preliminary data, but not much. But I thought I had a great idea. And so I didn't get that funded. I got a decent score. I don't remember what it was, but the pay line for R21s, at least in NIDDK there, you had to score better. Basically, it was more competitive. I don't know why. And my program officer I talked to said, they really like the idea. If you can just get a little bit more preliminary data, and she just encouraged me to instead write that as an R01. And so I did, and I got it funded. And so if you have the luxury of enough resources to collect a little more preliminary data, then going for the R01, I agree with what Frankie Wong said, that it's just as much work to write the grant. You go through all that work. With an R21, you only get 2 years of funding. So almost by the time it's begun, you got to have to write a grant again, right? And on the other hand, if you have an R01, it's always going to be inspiring new ideas and side projects and things that you want to do, but you just don't have the resources. You might need some new, viral tools or whatever, you would be using for your own research. And there, an R21 is a great mechanism because it allows you to go off on a side project, get some more resources, maybe to pay for a technician to do it. And then that 2-year project, you can sort of overlap, with your R01. And then you're collecting data that you can use for your R01 competing renewal. Now you've got this other cool stuff going on. And so I've been considering doing that. I have 2 R01s right now, and they both are going to end in the same year, which on the one hand, it's great to have 2 R01s. On the other hand, that means I'm going to have to be writing 2 competing applications for the same cycle. And I'm really thinking about doing an R21 maybe next year on one grant and maybe one on the other grant, just to provide some overlap funding and be able to develop, I don't know, I haven't quite figured it out yet.
Yeah, that's very consistent with what I would say. The advice I got was to not apply for an R21 if you can help it, basically, especially early, because it's just not worth the work for the reward at the end of it. So I actually have never written an R21 or O3 application at this point, but I've also seen people where the situation dictated that was a good idea. Like you might have a big R01 that is going too many directions, and it might be good to split off a piece as an R21 and keep the rest as an R01. So there certainly are situations where I think it makes sense too, like Linda was saying.
Well, and also for career development, if you're, pursuing tenure, if you don't have an R01 yet, if you're going to be applying for tenure stream positions, usually your faculty advisory council committee will tell you it's best to go for an R01. Having an R21 is fine, but an R01 is really, it tells the university that you are worth investment of continued resources.
That's great. Erin, I wanted to ask you, as someone who is still a little earlier in your career, when did you decide to start going for the R01? And I know we have some people on the call who are early in their careers, and what advice might you give them for starting that process?
Yeah, boy. I think it's a tough question. I think it's probably the same process for any grant, really, when you have preliminary data to make sure that you can show that you can do what you're saying you want to do. If you need your preliminary data to say, hey, this is probably going to work, then you got to get to that point. So I think it's really dictated by what data you have, and when your data hits that point that you're ready to put the application in. Because I don't think you want to, I think it's better not to start off with a half put together application. So I'd say as long as you can afford it in terms of funding your research, it's probably best just to watch the data and get your data to the point where you have the pieces you need to check off all those boxes for the application. So for me, I think that was pretty quick because I was able to bring some data with me and bring some data with me I could start analyzing right away. I think it was about a year or a little over a year, but I think I wouldn't worry so much about a timeline as when the data is saying, hey, it's time.
Linda, Frankie, do you have any comments to make on that?
My career was a little bit convoluted. I started out with an academic position, and then within a couple of years, I was not happy, and I left. And I spent 7 years in the field. As a social psychologist, I was running programs for a community-based agency. But in the community-based agency, I had to write grant to support the program. So at the time, I ended up writing a lot of successful grants funded by HRSA, SAMHSA, CDC. These are more health program grants. So I learned a lot about writing grant, being able to tell a story. So I was able to translate my skill set. When I decided to go back to come back to academia full time, and I said, no, I really want to do scientific research. So without thinking, maybe it's my own arrogance or maybe my naivete, I just decided I'm going to write an R01. And I hit it the first time. And then within a year, I hit the second R01, like first run. And just going on, then I built a base. So I don't think my experience is common in terms of incremental, but rather I think the skill set, able to write competitive grant, helped me transition into an R01 very successfully. You just using slightly different language, but you still need to have the logical thinking, critical thinking, be able to measure your outcome, all these other things. So I know that we're talking about NIH right now, but I encourage my junior colleague to think beyond just NIH. Grant is grant. If you have a good research idea, it will support your work in the long run.
Awesome. Linda, do you have anything to add? And if not, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Okay. So you said that you are on a multi-PI R01. Would you tell us a bit about what that entails, the dynamics of working with other researchers?
Yeah, it's It grew out of a preliminary pilot funding. It was called a team science grant at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. And my collaborator is actually the fellow I did my first postdoc with, Pat Levitt. And so he, he's a developmental neuroscientist and really heavy duty molecular biology, which is not my forte. My forte is microscopy, neuroanatomy, behavior. And of course he knows this. We've collaborated off and on over the years, just, now and then he'll have a project and want some anatomy and I'll help him out, and I'll have a project and I'll need some molecular and he's like the first person I'll ask. And so we've had a relationship for a while. So fast forward, this team science grant, he, learned of this bucket of money that we could apply for. We had talked before at a couple of meetings about, I won't bore you with the details of the project, but it's an early life stress model, and it's relevant to human disorders, but we're using a mouse model. So we had a novel hypothesis about a certain neural pathway, and it just arose out of conversation. And so we wrote the grant collaboratively, and this is where, some of the tools available now, the Google documents. We're both like, I'd get up early in the morning and I'd open the document up and start to be working on it. All of a sudden I'd see colored lines of text and he's working on it together. It was kind of fun. It just really facilitates the writing. We could just do it together, bounce all ideas off each other. It came together really easily. His postdoc came to my lab to train. She taught us some of the techniques they're doing. One of my investigators went out there because we're trying to use the same model, and so we want to standardize all the procedures, and then the endpoints are different. And so there was just a lot of, back and forth and collaboration. I feel like it's kind of special and unique, but I haven't talked to other people that have multi-PI projects, so I don't know how special and unique it is. But I'm excited because it just expands the technical tools you can use and the breadth of the question you can ask. It's a little bit like a program project grant, and those are awarded typically to institutions, in the same location. Here it's across the country. So it's a little bit different that way.
That's great. Yeah, Frankie, I wanted to ask earlier during the Allen Q&A, you had talked about sometimes it may be good to switch who's the primary and who's the secondary researcher to help get a grant funded. Could you tell us a bit more about what you might advise for people who have primary and secondary and who should be in what slot?
Well, at least in that particular situation, I was at Emory at the time, and my junior colleague has a student that she wanted to support for an F31, and his interest is on intimate partner violence among gay and bisexual men, and which I know some, but I'm definitely not an expert. And he wanted to study in South Africa, which I have research in South Africa. So at least I know the country, I know the environment and things like that. So I said, great, let's just go about and supporting him. So I was his secondary mentor, like my colleague is the primary mentor. The review were very favorable. They really want to fund the grant, but the reviewer has concern about my colleague, who at the time is assistant level professor. Okay, NIH is a very good old boy system. I just feel that she actually knows more than I do. She published in Lancet, okay? Like how many people who's an assistant professor published in Lancet. But nonetheless, it is what NIH want. NIH said, no, I really don't think like she really have the experience and background to really support this F31. They would highly recommend that Dr. Wong be the primary mentor and she be my co-mentor. We say, fine. It doesn't really change the dynamic of the existing working relationship. But it's important to actually create your mentoring team in such a way in the eye of the reviewer that is competitive. These days, reviewer really want to know whether your mentor actually is physically within your institution. one of the challenges that I am working with some of my junior colleagues is that our health science portfolio here, with exceptions of psychology, if you place outside the neuroscience, like such as my work in HIV, is really small. So the question becomes like, who can be the one that help other junior faculty maybe interested in cardiovascular diseases, interested in diabetes? If you don't have someone physically here, it's really hard to convince NIH that, okay, this is a good mentoring team. Then the way I compensate this, like, is I would ask my junior colleagues that, who are the other mentor you have that are not physically here? All of us collectively trying to work on a project together. We publish together. We establish a track record of some sort, so that when we resubmit, we can say that we are an establishing team. We are not just some strangers just coming together. So I don't have a fixed solution, but like, you have to be very creative, willing to think outside the box.
Erin, Linda, do you have anything to add?
Not necessarily. I wanted to talk a little bit to a topic, but I have to ask you if it's already been covered about when you are starting. Well, there's two things I was hoping to have a chance to talk about. One is when you're preparing to write the R01, like being able to get feedback and get help. And I have a few ideas about that. And the second is after you get the R01, relationship with your program officer. So have these things already been discussed?
No, and they sound wonderful. Please do. Yes, I would love to hear more.
I'll keep it brief. I was just thinking about the panel, I just wanted to share an approach that I've used successfully. You know, I've got every R01 I've written, I've gotten it. Maybe not the first time, but I eventually have. And it all starts with the idea. The specific aims are so important. You should not start to write your grant until you've got your specific aims pretty polished. I mean, you'll edit them, but the advantage of getting feedback on those specific aims, I cannot overemphasize, because you want to give it to colleagues. And if they only have one page to read, you're going to get a lot of people that will say, fine. Now, if you're going to send, you know, your whole 12-page grant off to people, that's a big burden, right? That's a lot to ask. First thing you should do is write your specific aims and get feedback. And through that feedback, you may adjust them, you may change them, but it keeps the burden low on people that can help you. But when the study section is reading your grant, that's the first page they're going to read. And if you can catch them on that first page, if you can spark their enthusiasm and, you know, get them to buy in that, you know, the literature, your, you know, background paragraph, that you have an intriguing question that's going to address an important thing that's not been addressed, and that the answer is going to be important, right? Not just that it hasn't been done before, but that we need to know this because, and then your aims is just like, you know, what are you going to find out? And just briefly, what approach are you going to use? But you don't want all those details. Just that one page, it's so important. And I've done that for every grant I've written. You know, I've written specific aims and I've sent it off to friends and colleagues, people, some of whom are working in the area. You know, my collaborators, even my competitors, you know, if you have friendly relationships with other scientists, this is helpful. You know, people that they're publishing papers, and I wish that was my paper. You know, that's the kind of science I want to do. But you just, you know, as you build your network, you'll meet more people. I got so much good feedback, you know, either this is a great question. Yes, this is fantastic. We really need to know this. Or, you know, I think this has already been done. You may have missed, you know, you missed these papers over here. And it's just really been helpful. So not to blather on about that, but that's one piece of advice. And I tell that to my trainees. I tell that to grad students and postdocs I've worked with that have gone on to write their own grants. And of course, I'm the one giving them feedback then, along with other people. Anybody will give you feedback on one page, though. And then the other thing that I wanted to make sure I mentioned in this panel is I used to not know, nobody told me that I needed to develop a relationship with my program officer. They were just a name on a page. And, you know, I'm old, so this was before email, you know, and you couldn't just quickly send an email off. You'd have to make a phone call or write a letter and mail it, you know, to talk to them. And I just never bothered. I never thought it was important. And suddenly, as I got more mature in the field, I kept hearing people saying, oh, my program officer said this, or oh, said that. And I'm like, you've talked to your program officer? What? And I realized, oh, I should have been doing this. And so I made the effort. It's easy via email. It can be intimidating sometimes to contact these people who you know, they have some power over you in a way, right? But email makes it easy. And what I do is I send an email and I'll say very briefly, you know, this is my grant. I don't assume they remember me or my grant. This is my grant. This is the title. I'd like to talk to you. You know, please let me know when you might be available. And then they usually email right back, and then you set up a phone call, because the program officers don't want to put a lot of stuff in written record. They want to talk to you. You know, it's like they want to give you advice, but they don't want to break the rules about that. So anyway, it's really important. They can help guide you. They can, if you don't get your grant funded, especially if it's a competing renewal and you already know them, you know, they can give you some feedback from listening to the discussion, things that you wouldn't necessarily glean from reading the reviews. You know, you get the reviews back and there's 3 reviewers that say 3 different things, and you don't really know, well, what's the most important. And the program officer can tell you the thing, oh, that's not really that, don't worry about that. But this thing you really need to worry about. So anyway, it's important. And then the other thing is the program officer can sometimes bring to your attention new funding opportunities, because he or she will know your work pretty well. And I had this happen recently. My program officer told me that there was an administrative supplement that I should apply for, because in conversation, I told her I had 2 new graduate students starting, and both of them, you know, met criteria for diversity candidates. And I had just mentioned this in passing, because we were talking about what they might apply for, you know, for funding. And she said, and then she followed up with me and she said, oh, you should really apply for this. And she sent me information, and we had a whole phone call where for like half an hour, she told me all the things to make sure I include in my application, and don't say this, make sure you don't say that, but make sure you say this. And I mean, I have no idea if it'll be funded, but I would not have gotten any of that if I hadn't reached out to her. So, okay, I talked a lot. I'm done now.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Erin, Frankie, anything you want to add to that, or another topic you want to touch on?
But what Linda just said is so very, very true. Like review, if you cannot get the review attention in a specific game, oftentimes the rest of it, they just glide over. The relationship with the PO is so important that I had a wonderful PO NO60, but now she's retired after 27 years. Every time when I have an idea, I bounce it off with her. She is such a great PO. She gave me line by line editing. I mean, but maybe she's a rare breed. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but I also have a PO that is also very responsive. Like Linda said, like there was like just last week, they sent me something about minority supplement, administrative supplement. Like you have the relationship, they remember you. So if your score, like say this particular R21 that I talked about recently, my PO really want to fund it. So even if I were, like, let's assume I was really borderline, she can advocate in front of council and make that happen. And as like Pamela was saying that 2% didn't get funded, but rather the 10% get funded just because it fit the priority of the institution. So this human relationship feed into the scientific process, but oftentimes you don't learn it in school, you don't learn it in classroom, what have you. But I cannot emphasize everything Lord Linda said is so true. So.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of those points about specific games and making sure you have a good idea, because if you're not off to a good start, you're definitely in trouble right away. And then I think about the PO, I think that's also great advice. I've certainly gotten good feedback, and POs can save you from making mistakes. They can help you out in lots of ways that you don't even think of until you're talking to them on the phone about these things. So that's certainly important too. I've also had some really bad POs. So when that happens, you might not want to invest quite as much time into that relationship, because I've had a PO where I'm getting the advice like, yeah, I'm not really sure they're helping you out here. So, I mean, you also talk to other people too and make sure you're getting good advice, I think. But especially good POs, they can really help you a lot. I completely agree with that.
That's awesome. Before we open it up for questions, is there a single burning topic that you want to share with us about what we can keep in mind as we're writing our R01s?
The only thing I would add is be persistent. It's very difficult nowadays to get your grant funded, top 10%. That means 90% of the applications are not going to get funded. And it doesn't mean that 90% of the applications are bad, right? It's just there's a limited pot of money. It used to be that 30% would get funded. It's not that it's just the pot of money, compared to the number of applications is different now. Persistence pays off. I've been on study section for many, many years, and I often see the same grant several times, and it gets better each time. Maybe the topic changes, the title changes. But people who are persistent, usually, I guess you don't know the ones that drop off, but a lot of them will eventually get funded. And, so it's just like anything in life. If you really want it, be persistent and keep asking for help.
Yeah, I had to do both things. I had to be persistent and I had to keep asking for help and work to find the right people, work to find the right study section. Like all that takes work and persistence.
Frankie, anything you'd want to bring up?
Well, I agree with both Linda and Aaron. Persistent, and there are many more smart people than me, but I am very persistent. That's got get to where I am today. I do want to talk about the MPI thing because my current study is an MPI study. So I applied the study together with a colleague of mine at Temple, and her background is in chronic disease and prevention, mostly cancer related. And I met her when we were both charter member of a study section. And on the surface of it, we actually have little in common because she studied cancer, I studied HIV. But she has inside scoop about certain institute is going to come up with an RFA regarding about HIV among minority. And I said, but Grace, you and I never collaborated before, so how are we going to make a case, right? But nonetheless, we make a case. So I said, okay, let me take over as the contact PI because this is about HIV. So well, I'm an HIV person. And I was still at University of Hawaii. She was at Temple. So that was 2017 or something like that. I joined FSU 2018. And literally 2 months after I finished, I landed here in August. In September, that R01 was awarded, but awarded to Hawaii because I was from Hawaii when I applied the grant. So it took me 1 full year before I can transfer the grant over here. And the MPI part is very interesting. So these are about post-management because I did not really want to basically go through because the study site is in Hawaii and Philadelphia because she had background with African American. I have background with Asian and Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian. I do not want the IRB to redo all over again. So I'm argue the fact NIH actually allowed for my IRB to stay in Hawaii and FSU created a reliable agreements with Hawaii. So I have my local PI in Hawaii to be the contact PI for the IRB, even though the grant is now physically at FSU. So all this administrative post-management had nothing to do with science, has to do with scientific management. So.
That's great. Thank you so much.